Welcome to Behind the Book with Friends in Fiction. I am Patti Callahan Henry, and with Mary Kay Andrews, Kristin Harmel, and Woodson Harvey, we host the Friends in Fiction show for New York Times bestselling authors and list stories. Here we interview authors to support indie bookstores, libraries, and readers like you. Today, I am the luckiest to be talking to Frye Gaillard. Frye is a former writer in residence at the University of South Alabama and the author of more than 30 books. 30 books. Among his award winning titles are Cradle of Freedom, Watermelon Wine, The Spirit of Country Music. Don't think we're getting out of here without talking about country music.
All right.
And A Hard Rain, America in the 1960s, which we'll be talking about today. He is the winner of the F. Scott Fitzgerald Museum Literary Prize, among many, many others. A Hard Rain was also named by NPR to its list of best books. Gaillard has won numerous awards and has bylines that are too many to list. He is a graduate of Vanderbilt and a native of Mobile, where he currently lives. So I'm going to get us started by telling all of you a quote about his book, A Hard Rain, because you will want to stay and hear more. The 60s had it all: social movements and space exploration, one in a generation musicians and once in a lifetime martyrs, a Cold War and a hot one too. A Hard Rain ties it all together in poetic prose that makes the pain and pleasure, tragedy and triumph of these tumultuous years come alive. So instead of talking about Frye, let's talk to him. Welcome, Frye. I'm so happy you're here.
Thank you, Patty. It's good to see you again.
Always. So we're going to dive right in
Okay.
because the 60s, which is, kind of a mythical time, right?
Right.
When we think about it, I was born in the 60s, but the 60s were your coming of age decade, during which you went from junior high to the beginning of your career as a writer. I want you to tell us about this pivotal moment you had that I think took you into journalism. At the
hmm
start, you were 16 years old and
I was on a high school field trip from Mobile to Birmingham, and I guess I vaguely knew at that point that there were civil rights demonstrations taking place in Birmingham. But I was raised in pretty typical circumstances for a white kid from Mobile. Prosperous family, a lot of privilege, all of that. And I'd kind of learned that there were certain things you didn't talk about much, and
Mhm.
civil rights movement was one of them. But anyway, I was on this field trip and I walked out of my hotel room in the morning, and there, maybe 5 or 6 feet from where I stepped onto the sidewalk, was Dr. Martin Luther King being arrested.
Oh,
He was being pushed roughly up the Birmingham sidewalk by these two sort of burly Birmingham police officers. They were not being brutal, but they were being, I thought, disrespectful and kind of shoving him along. And I was just a kid, right? And I was startled. I didn't know what to think. I
yeah.
certainly had no way of knowing that this was a historic moment that would lead to Dr. King writing his famous letter from a Birmingham jail, which he did after this arrest. What I did know was that as they pushed him past where I had stopped to watch, I found myself actually looking into the face of Martin Luther King. And he had, I still remember these large, dark, expressive eyes. And
Mm.
and I was just struck by that in a way that I could never get it out of my mind. I thought
Yeah.
what I saw in those eyes was this deep well of sadness. And so all of a sudden it was like, history had a face. I mean, I didn't have those words for it at the time, but that was the way it came to seem to me as time went by. And so I think that was the probably the genesis for wanting to write these kind of stories and to
Yeah.
look for, the story, the humanity, the human face in current events and historical narratives that were taking place in front of our eyes.
What an astounding story to be in the middle of history and Frye not even know you were in the middle of history. I
Yeah.
mean, you probably had some sense, but at 16, you know.
I was pretty clueless, and I would
Yeah,
love to say that, immediately I understood the stakes and the moral, issues that were being addressed by this movement and stuff. But that's not true. It took me a while to
of course.
process this, and I went off to Vanderbilt a couple of years later, and got there when the first class of African American undergraduates got there. And so there was a lot of conversation about the issue of race.
Yeah.
And these, as you can imagine, were just extraordinary young people, brilliant, really. Some of the most impressive classmates that I had. And so, it was just transformative to be there for 4 years during the middle of, what turned out to be such a tumultuous decade.
Well, and a decade that changed everything.
Yeah.
So you portray a lot of that in A Hard Rain, but the former executive editor of the New York Times and a winner of the Pulitzer, Howell Raines, said, "A child of the 60s and one of the leading civil rights reporters of his generation, Frye has given us a riveting tour along what he calls the fine line between history and journalism." And I've read you where you've said, if history is a story, then to me, this is the American story and the opportunity of the nonfiction writer to bring it to life. So, talk to us about what that means to you, the fine line between history and journalism, between nonfiction and fiction, and the privilege and opportunity to bring it to life. Why is it important?
Well, as I came of age and began to read other writers who were writing in the genre of nonfiction, people like David Halberstam or
Yeah.
Doris Kearns Goodwin or
Wow. Yeah.
Willie Morris, people like that. What I thought was these are people with a sense of story.
Yeah.
They have a sense of history too, but they see history as a story. They see current events as a story, and so it it seemed to me, as it seemed to some of them, that all of the elements that are available to the writer of great fiction, the elements of character or plot or dialogue,
Mhm.
theme, all of those things are also available to the writer of nonfiction. Instead of being created, it's more like they're discovered, you know.
I like that.
And so but the obligation to tell a good story and to capture the humanity of it
Yeah.
is something that is shared. And I read some of your work coming at history through fiction, and yet the history you reveal, is in some ways more powerful, through the lens of fiction. And so I've always been influenced by people who wrote historical fiction. I remember when I first read John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, just bringing the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression to light in such an amazing way. I remember going to a high school teacher and I said, "Well, I mean, like, did this happen?" You know, and of course it did. But Steinbeck was a journalist who wrote about that before he turned it into a novel. And what I'm saying is, you have an opportunity, even as a journalist or a historian, to tell a good story. And so that's been the mission, for a lot of years now.
As you do in A Hard Rain. We were writing back and forth about it, and you said that that generation made a leap of faith. And
Right.
I was like, maybe that could have been the title. It's just such a
Yeah. Yeah.
it's exactly provocative of what the book is about, that love could be a more powerful force than hate. And in a literary sense, you say the rest of the decade was a test of that faith against our better angels and their opposites. But what you do is you take that kind of overarching idea and put it into scenes. So tell us how Hard Rain shows us the truth. What is I know it opens with a dormitory bull session, but kind of take us from there into
Right.
how you take these leaps of faith and show us the truth in Hard Rain.
Okay. In the dormitory bull session that you mentioned, it was four African American students at North Carolina A&T in Greensboro. And
Okay.
these were really bright guys. They were 17, 18 years old. They were not the first in their families to go to college. And they often gathered at night in one of their dorm rooms or another to talk about, current events and things. And on this particular night, they started talking about segregation and the daily insult that they felt personally by white only signs or, different separate water fountains or segregated lunch
Yeah.
counters or whatever. And they were critical in this discussion of their parents for not doing anything about this.
Yeah.
And then they said to each other, well, what have we done? We haven't done anything. And so they started feeling bad about that. And so the next day they went down and sat in at a lunch counter in
That's so sad.
Greensboro. And it was the start of sit ins in the 1960s. At the same time, there were a group of students in Nashville that included John Lewis, who became an icon
Yes.
in, Southern history, civil rights history. And they were preparing for such a protest. They were taking classes in the theory and the philosophy and the theology of nonviolence. And
Okay.
what they were being taught and what they were coming to believe was that that would be their leap of faith, that they
Mm.
could go forward in love and confront the legacy of hate that had defined race relations in this country and that love would win. Now, think about that. That is an amazing leap that these young people were making. And in making it in 1960, they set the agenda for the whole decade. People still are in their
Fascinating.
teens or early 20s, And so that again, in terms of, telling the sort of meta narrative, you start
Yeah.
with, the scenes of these young people
Yeah.
and, try to bring them alive, which, they 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 were very much alive, and some of them talked with great clarity about their memory of those times, so that helped.
It's so fascinating. We think we understand it in movies or reading about it, but they didn't know what they were in the middle of. They just wanted to do something about it,
That's
you know?
right. They had no way to know what would happen
Yep.
next.
And what it
So,
would turn into.
yeah,
All right, I'm gonna shift gears a little bit before we
okay,
run out of time because
sure.
I'm a huge country music fan, and
Yes,
just this week we have found out that Toby Keith passed away.
yes, yes. Really talented guy,
Golly,
He
man.
had
He defines kind of my, late college, early he was so great. So tell us about Watermelon Wine.
Watermelon Wine was my first book. It came out in 1978, and it's kind of the world according to country music. It's looking at American life, the American story through kind of the lyrics of songs. And
Love it.
in the 1970s, that was a golden age for country music. Dolly
Yeah, I
Parton
know.
was just emerging as a megastar. Johnny
Mhm.
Cash was still doing what Johnny Cash
Yeah.
did. Emmylou Harris, Linda Ronstadt was singing, kind of country stuff or, alternative country anyway. Songwriters like Tom T. Hall and Loretta Lynn and people like that. So, Waylon and Willie, right? And so just having a chance to talk to these people about, what they were trying to do. And, it kind of gave me a sense of music as literature, right? I mean, yeah, you listen to it and that's great, but at its best, it also tells a story, explores the human condition in these little 3-minute vignettes, almost like 3-minute short stories, at their best. So that was what I was trying to capture in
Let's
that
not
in that
forget
first book.
George Jones and Tammy Wynette mixed up in there.
Absolutely,
Oh my
absolutely.
gosh,
Yes,
right?
yeah, I mean, the list is very long, and we
And a
can keep
Muscle
going.
Shoals and the
Yes,
whole thing.
absolutely. Yep,
It is
yep,
I could talk about that for hours.
yeah, me too.
But to round it out, a really sensitive subject, but an important one is in the news right now. And that is the layoff of hundreds, maybe thousands of journalists happening right now.
Right.
How do you think this will, being a journalist, knowing that your books are nonfiction, kind of with a story angle, but bent on journalism, how do you think this will affect our news and information?
I'm really worried about it.
Yeah.
I think the economics of daily journalism has been, part of the decline in our civic dialogue in the
Yeah.
last, 10, 15, 20 years. It's I remember when I was a young reporter and I took a job at the Charlotte Observer, and I was assigned to cover the city's busing crisis. Charlotte was the national test case for busing to integrate schools. And the editor said, I don't want you to tell people what to think. I want you to give them enough information so that they can think
Oh,
about
I
this
love that.
critically important issue, right? And, that's what we tried to do. That was sort of the mission of daily papers. And as they shrink, and the layoffs you mentioned are part of that shrinkage, then, they can't do it as well. And so
Yeah.
the void is filled by, conspiratorial voices and
Yeah.
other, toxic influences, I think. And I think we're paying the price. So I'm really worried about what you brought up.
So am I, and I think, it's got to swing the other way so that
Yes.
men like you, the jobs you do and have done before, that information comes across and not these tidbits that sway people with fear. So,
Yeah, I really think that's right. And all we can do is all we can do, right? We keep
yeah,
trying to tell the stories and,
pound the
you know,
drums.
pound
Yep.
the drums. Yeah.
Well, Fry, I'm so thrilled you joined us on the Friends and Fiction Show. You are always so fascinating to talk to. And I encourage everyone out there listening to go to bookshop.org and grab a hard rain or watermelon wine and dive into Fry's world. Thanks for being here with us.
Thank you so much, Patty. I loved it.